In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to pass information between different methods in your code. And there are a number of concepts we're going to talk about here. Firstly, whenever two methods are talking to each other, there's always a caller, the method that's calling, and the callee, the method that the caller is calling. And then next we're going to talk about how the callee can return data back to the caller. Have a look at the following example. Here I've got a right-angled triangle, and I've called this edge the adjacent edge, and this edge the opposite edge. And we want to be able to calculate the hypotenuse, the length of this edge. So I've modeled this in a Java class. I've created a class called right-angled triangle, and it has as fields an adjacent length and an opposite length. And I've added in a constructor and a couple of methods. One of those methods is to be able to get the length of the hypotenuse. Alright. Then I've got a main class, a main method. And in my main method, I have created a right-angled triangle. Now, it's possible for me to call this method from this main method. So if I write in rat dot get hypotenuse length, what I've done is I've called this method from the main method. In other words, the main method is the caller of the get hypotenuse method. And the get hypotenuse method, since it's the one being called, is the callee. So my main method is the caller. It's the method calling the other method. And the get hypotenuse method is the callee. It's the method being called by the main method. Let's take a closer look at the get hypotenuse length method. So far, all your methods have been public void methods, and inside your method you have somewhere along the line either used javascript or system.println to print out information inside those methods. The get hypotenuse method squares the length of the adjacent side, squares the length of the opposite side, and then calculates the length of the hypotenuse using Pythagoras. But what if instead we wanted to return this value to the caller being the main method, and we would rather have the main method decides how it should display the value? Well, to do that, we have to first change our method from a void method to a typed method. In this case, we're going to be returning the hypotenuse's length, which will be a double. And here, instead of printing out the value, we're going to return the value to the caller. So a return statement always returns something, in this case a double, to the caller. So here I'm going to do h length, and then here in the main method we can call our get hypotenuse length function, which will return to us the hypotenuse length. So then we can save that as a variable. So I'm going to say double h hypotenuse equals rat.get hypotenuse length, and then I can choose what to do with that. So I could, if I wanted to, print out that hypotenuse length using system.println, or I could do the same thing but with JOptionPane. Or I could even perform some sort of logic on the hypotenuse length. Doing things this way adds a lot of flexibility to our code. You can see that it's entirely up to the caller what to do with the value that's returned. As opposed to before, when we had the system.out.print line inside the get hypotenuse length, the only way we could ever see that value was via system.out.print line. Whereas now, even I might call the same function in many places, and each time I might choose to do something different with the value that's returned. To show you how this works, when I run my program and I get to the line where I call the function, in other words, where the caller, the main method, calls the callee, it then steps into this function and gets to here and runs those lines of code. So it squares the adjacent length, squares the opposite length, calculates the hypotenuse length, and then it gets to this return statement. What the return statement says is saying, okay, return to the caller, but return with this value. So then when we step next, we come back to here, back to the caller, back to the main method. But now we've returned with the value of h length. And that's what it will then save into hypotenuse, which in this case is 50. And then we can choose what we want to do with that value. So in this case, I printed it out. I showed up a J option pane, which is on my other screen there. And I could even perform some logic, checking if the length is, say, 100 greater than 100 and doing some further logic with it. So let's recap. The main method in this case was known as the caller because it's calling the get hypotenuse length function. The get hypotenuse length function is the callee, and in order for a method to return values to its caller, you first must specify, you change it from void, and you must specify the type that you're going to return. So in this case it was double, and then you must have a return statement somewhere in your function that then returns a double back to the caller. And a reminder as to why this is useful is because it gives the caller the ability to decide what to do with the value rather than the callee deciding what to do with the value. And it also means that if the same function is called in multiple places, you have the flexibility to make a different decision about what to do with the return value in each case.